trust means that you can't put check on everything, because that's almost the opposite of trust. We think about those places where we have to have locks and guards and searchlights and all. That's because we don't trust the environment we're in to provide any kind of security. So what I found, it's first, trust takes time. Stan and Will don't have trust until we've interacted a bit. Now, if somebody who knows you very well comes to me and says, Stan, trust Will, I will extend some trust because I trust that other person, but I won't automatically completely trust you, because we just don't have enough history for me to feel comfortable that you have proven that you can do what you say you do, that you have integrity, and we don't have a relationship.
Hello and welcome to Franklin Covey on Leadership. I'm your host, Will Houghteling. Today's guest is General Stanley McChrystal. Stan McChrystal was the former commander of U.S. Special Forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. He was the leader of the Joint Special Operations Command and a 4-star general. Former Defense Secretary Robert Gates described McChrystal as perhaps the finest warrior and leader of men in combat I ever met. Since retiring from the military in 2010, Stanley McChrystal has taught courses in international relations at Yale University, and he is the author of 5 best-selling books, including the recently published On Character, The Choices That Define a Life. In today's conversation, we'll discuss everything from his experience in the military to his leadership lessons across his 5 books, his lessons from being married for nearly 50 years, and the future of military and global political conflict. General Stan McChrystal, welcome to Franklin Covey on Leadership.
Will, thanks for having me.
Wonderful. I'm very excited for today's conversation. So you have a storied military leadership career. You are the former commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, former commander of Joint Special Operations Command, 4-star general. What from your military leadership career are you proudest of?
Yeah, I think I'm proudest now of watching people that I served with that were younger than me, and as they've made their way up into positions of great responsibility. It's funny, every once in a while I'll get with a peer and I'll say, so-and-so's a great kid, and they're a major general. And so it is watching that development, because the military is all about leader development. You start on day one and it continues through your career, and they do a pretty good job of it. Not perfect, but pretty well. And that's the part that I take great satisfaction. Last week I went to the promotion of a female officer that worked with me in Iraq and Afghanistan. She was promoted to lieutenant general, or 3 stars, which is a challenge to make. I mean, she's an incredible professional, but just seeing that and see that she got promoted at the Lincoln Memorial. And so friends and family from around the country came to the Lincoln Memorial, stood out in the cold, and they watched her be elevated and also make some really stirring remarks.
Thank you for sharing. It's wonderful to hear about the lineage of leaders that I'm sure you have guided and mentored and advised along the way. I'm sure it's like the kind of Bill Belichick coaching tree as you look back. You recently published a book on character. It's really part memoir about your own experience and the lessons that you've learned along the way. And you talk about the choices that define your life. And so I want to ask the inverse of that same first question, which are, what are a couple of choices that you made over the course of your military career that you wish you had a do-over on, and what did you learn from those?
Yeah, it's funny. If I go back to when I was young, I went to West Point at age 17, and my father had gone to West Point. My grandfather had been a soldier. And so I wanted to be a soldier. And I go to the military academy in 1972 when the military was not that popular. So it was, relatively speaking, easy to be admitted, and therefore I got in. But I didn't take the place seriously. Now, I took being an Army officer 4 years later seriously, but when I got to West Point, I didn't study very hard. My disciplinary record for the first 2 years was abysmal. In fact, I almost got thrown out. And I came within a hair's breadth of that. And I've talked to cadets later, and it's a funny story later, because I got in all this trouble. I almost got thrown out, and then I become a 4-star general. But if I had gotten thrown out, it would be a completely different story. It would have been a missed opportunity for me in my life, and it would have also been a slot at the military academy that I had wasted that someone else who's more seriously could have taken. So I'm not saying that I want to go back in life and be more serious about everything I did. That's not my conclusion. My conclusion, though, is understand what matters and respect those things. Understand that our personal conduct, our integrity, our character matter every day of our life. And as soon as you learn those things that matter to you, value them, respect them, don't violate them, because at some point in life you may have great cause to regret that.
Do you think that almost getting kicked out did teach you how much it mattered to you? Like there's some counterfactual of had you been a really good student, you might not have turned into a 4-star general because you wouldn't have had that wake up moment. So how did you kind of learn from almost that failure?
That's a very charitable interpretation of it. No, Will, I don't think that. I think that I was just being immature and stupid. And then when I naturally hit a point where it became obvious to me what the right answer, I was given the opportunity to then pursue that without really paying my debts for those previous things. It's kind of like driving drunk when you're young. You know, the only time you're stupid enough to drive drunk is when you've been drinking. But the reality is, when I was younger, it was pretty common. You know, people did it all the time, and it was so irresponsible. What if we killed ourselves, or worse, somebody else? And then later you realize, wow, that was incredibly irresponsible. So I think I matured through that, just being lucky that those things didn't permanently stop me. And now in retrospect, of course, I'm a little more mature and hopefully a lot more mature and wiser. But I wish I had gotten that earlier.
You're known for being, and I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this podcast or not, but you're known for being a badass special ops guy. And you did many night raids with the Green Berets in Afghanistan and Iraq. Insofar as you're able to share about, could you maybe share about one of those night raids and kind of the leadership lesson, or kind of how you've gotten able to make decisions under pressure?
I think the first thing about going on something like a night raid, it sounds romantic, and in a degree it is, but I was going with very elite soldiers and sailors, Navy SEALs, Delta Force commandos, Army Rangers. So you are in very competent company. And sometimes people will say to me, you guys were so brave because you went out in the night and you attacked the enemy. Well, we did. But we had the advantage of knowing we were very well trained and we knew what we were attacking. I think of a young private from pick a state, Ohio, out defending a position, who doesn't have the same level of experience, never knows when the enemy is going to do a similar raid. So the levels of courage required, I think we sometimes understate what we get from common soldiers doing more routine tasks, which in fact require a lot. If you think about the experience in operations, sometimes they were dramatic. There would be, all the things that happen in a firefight. Sometimes they become almost humorous. And you don't expect that because you are going into combat. You've girded your equipment on. You're going to go out there. And we got off helicopters in Iraq one time, and that's a largely desert country, obviously 2 big rivers. But we got out and we start moving and we end up in a swamp. And I remember we're waist deep in this mud and we can't get through, we can't get to the thing. And I couldn't help but just start laughing. And all of us start laughing because here we are, this most elite force in the world, going to do this surgical raid on a target, and we are waist deep in mud like a bunch of idiots. And the reality is that kind of thing happened on enough frequency that you couldn't take things too seriously. You had to be able to sometimes step back and go, yeah, okay, we are not, these stereotypical heroes. We are just good people out here trying to do good work, but it sometimes gets really, really stupid, I guess.
Over the course of your military career, you had the great fortune of working with many incredible leaders, presidents, secretaries of defense, et cetera. Is there a leader or two who really impressed you, and what about them impressed you so much that you tried to maybe you borrowed lessons from them?
Yeah, there are a number of them. I'd like to tell you about a couple if I could. One was a commanding general of Joint Special Operations Command when I was a little younger, when I was back on the staff, a guy named Bill Garrison. And he was a Texan, and he was a character. And he would sit in his office with unlit cigars, and he'd rear back. But he had this, it seemed like Texas country wisdom, but you strip that all out, it was just plain wisdom. When he took over the command, he gave one piece of guidance out, and he put it on a piece of paper, and he had copies made and was put on bulletin boards, and it says, "My command guidance: in all instances, you will use your best judgment." And you think about that, that's kind of extraordinary. It's so obvious, but it's not common. And then later, he was the commanding general when the force took place in the fight in Mogadishu on 3-4 October 1993. And people remember that from the motion picture Black Hawk Down, with all the drama of that. And there was incredible heroism during that event. But the thing that really strikes me is afterward, he was called back to the United States to testify in front of Congress, and they asked him basically to complain about not being given some of the aircraft and armored vehicles that he in fact had asked for. And they were trying to get him to say, if I had gotten more, and therefore to point the blame at higher up. And he looked at people and he said, okay, it was a gunfight. I was in command. I'm responsible. If you want to blame anything on anyone, here I am. And he refused to try to pass culpability for any frustrations to anyone else, because he understood that's what command is. That's what real leadership is. And I think everybody loved him when he was in the job, but you couldn't help but revere him. And then another person that I worked with was junior to me in rank. He was a regimental sergeant major of the Ranger Regiment and later became sergeant major of U.S. Army Special Operations Command and Joint. And a guy named Mike Hall. And Mike was like E.F. Hutton, if you remember the old commercials where when E.F. Hutton talks, everybody gets quiet and listens. And Mike, not a big guy, but when he led the Rangers and we would go on an operation, after the operation, typically as the commander and the sergeant major, we would go to the organization and we'd talk about what went right and what didn't. And here I was, the commander, and I would talk and everybody would be polite and listen. And then I would turn it over to Mike for his observations, and they would all pull out notebooks and start taking notes. And, of course, that's humbling, but he was just so thoughtful, not braggadocious. He was courageous, but he understood what we were about. And he used to have a saying that says, people won't care for what you do until they know how much you care. And I think signaling that as a leader, it's not stereotypical for the TV, two-dimensional sergeant major, but it is the essence of leadership. He lives in Franklin, Tennessee, and he did some work in the business world. We did it together for a number of years after we both left. And he works with an organization called Rangers for Life. And what they do is they take people who are coming out of service in the Ranger Regiment and going off into civilian life, and he helps find opportunities for them. And it's been transformational for now almost a generation of former Rangers.
Wow. That's a great segue to my next question as I want to talk about your transition from military life. So you resigned from the military in 2010. Talking about the psychology of after having your entire career, and I know you grew up in a military family and your wife is from a military family, after having grown up and lived in the military for so long, how did you find the transition to civilian life? What was the hardest part about that transition?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Will. First, just to give people background, I mentioned my father and his father being soldiers. All my brothers were soldiers. I went to West Point at age 17. All I'd ever thought about was being a soldier. And then when I left the service, I was 55, about to be 56. All I knew in my identity was being a soldier. And it ended suddenly. I submitted my resignation, it was accepted, and boom, I'm out. The downside is it was disorienting. It was upsetting. It was frightening, to be honest. And it put everything that I thought about myself sort of in play. For a while, I wondered who I was and what I was. And then over time, you learn a couple things. First, you're the same person after that event that you were before. You've had another experience, and it might have been a little bit bruising, but you've got all the same talent, wisdom that you had before. You just got to remember that. The second thing was, it was for me an impetus to do several things. The first, if you were just going to sort of fade into retirement, leaving suddenly jolted me out of that. I wanted to prove to myself, and I think I wanted to prove to other people, that I could do things, and I could do things very well. I wasn't just a one-trick pony as a soldier. And so we started a company, and most retired military don't start companies because there's risk and you've never been in business before, and I didn't know anything. But it pushed me into doing that. And it turned out to be one of the most fortunate circumstances of my life, because it's now almost 16 years old, got 100 people. McChrystal Group is this vibrant collection of talent that is a great place in the marketplace, but it's also reinforced for me, hey, I can do stuff. I can build stuff. You know, we can learn new things that we didn't do before. And I think everybody benefits if they get a reset in life. And the thing is, sometimes that reset has to be forced on you. I think had I stayed in the Army 2 more years like I'd planned and then retired normally, I probably would have eased into sort of normal retirement. But this one jolted me. It also made me think about myself more. It made me not look in the mirror and say, hey, retired general, looking good. Instead, it made me say, okay, wait a minute, what are you going to be now? And it made me think about my values. It made me think about my relationships. It made me realize just how important my family is and my friends are. And I probably knew that before, but sometimes you need that pulled in front of you and reinforced. When I retired, I didn't want to have a ceremony because I was sort of embarrassed by the way I left the service. But I was told by people, you need to have one because it's not for you, it's for other people who care about you. And we had this ceremony where people came from all parts of my life. And it was like this huge net that formed people who care about you. And suddenly you're reminded you're not alone, you never were. And that was a gift, and it's been that way ever since.
That's powerful. In 2010, did you ever consider running for public office, or have you considered it since then?
I didn't in 2010. I have considered it since then, because I think that America's politics could use a bit of redirection. I think it needs good people. I've concluded that I'm not the right person for that. I think we need a younger generation running, but I think we in my generation, actually every generation, but particularly mine, we need to create an environment that is healthier for people running. Right now, because of the effects of money, because of the effects of social media and some of the toxicity, to go into politics is a blood sport. And we are asking people to put themselves and their families through a gauntlet that, you know, rational people typically don't want to do. We've got to fix that, or we're not going to get the best and brightest taking on the hardest jobs in our country. Instead, we're going to get the people who are opportunists, who are self-oriented or self-focused entirely. And so I think now in my life, if I can do anything to help shape that environment, it's the contribution that I owe.
Strong teams are built in moments of uncertainty. Franklin Covey's guide, Help Your Team Thrive in Times of Change, empowers leaders with clarity, compassion, and direction to support teams during unpredictable times. Grab your free copy from the show notes to build trust, strengthen connection, and maintain momentum in a changing environment. So since leaving the military, in addition to starting the McChrystal Group, you've been a prolific author. I think you've written 5 books. I think maybe all of them have become bestsellers. Your memoir, My Share of the Task, 2015's Team of Teams, Leaders, Myth, and Reality, Risk, The User's Guide, and now most recently On Character. So I'd love to talk through some of the kind of key lessons and insights from them. In Team of Teams, you published in 2015, you talked about how JSOC broke silos and became a network. And in that book, you discuss the importance of creating a shared consciousness. So can you explain shared consciousness in layman's terms and how the organizations you work with in the McChrystal Group can actually implement it?
Yeah, absolutely. Shared consciousness turned out to be the central idea that we created in Joint Special Operations Command because we needed to. We had to change the way we operated dramatically, and we were geographically dispersed across 27 countries. So we had to operate with a single mind, but leveraging the initiative and innovation across the team. So how do you do that? Well, we were empowered by the fact that technology had lurched forward, and we now had secure video teleconference everywhere across our command. So we could do something you couldn't have done 5 or 10 years before that. But you still got this challenge of dispersion. And yet you've got to resynchronize the organization every 24 hours because that's the speed of modern war. And so we came up with the idea that we needed to communicate more aggressively, more completely, more effectively than we'd ever dreamed of. You couldn't do it once a quarter. You couldn't come together for an annual offsite in a business and develop a strategy and last for a year because conditions change so much. You got to change it tomorrow. Not every aspect of it, but you got to resync. So what we did was we did a daily secure video teleconference for the entire command, 7,500 people every day, 90 minutes long. And people, when I say that, they sort of recoil and they go, that's the mother of all meetings, that's terrifying. What it did is it synchronized the organization operationally, like going into the huddle with the quarterback every day, but it also synced us culturally more than we ever had before because we had disparate organizations with different cultures and backgrounds, almost different languages. And so it took time and constant communication. And so over time, it allowed us to focus on the joint mission, not everybody doing their just narrow part of it, but the reality that what matters for the game is what's on the scoreboard, not an individual's batting average. And so we were able to wrestle the organization into this level of common contextual understanding that I found extraordinarily effective in commercial enterprises since I've started McChrystal Group. And it's not 90 minutes every day. That was a unique environment. But it's this idea that if you've ever been a part of a very small group, 4 or 5 people, and you can finish each other's sentences, you know each other what you're doing so well, it's almost organic. You are doing that at scale. And when you create that magic, people operate with less direct supervision. They take more ownership of their responsibilities. They make decisions faster. It just unlocks capacity across the organization.
So when you work with corporations now and help them implement this shared consciousness with this operating rhythm of a daily sync, as you said yourself, a 90-minute organization-wide meeting seems incredibly cumbersome. So very tactically, how do you guide companies to generate a shared consciousness? I love the idea of transparency and empowered execution, but how tactically do you get to that shared consciousness?
Yeah, well, that's a great question because if you just say, okay, everybody get on a call tomorrow and we'll talk for 90 minutes, you'll do it once. And a few people will think it's a good thing and everybody else will think it's a waste of time and nobody will come and you'll waste it. So the first thing we do is we are very focused on what the organization's trying to do. And usually it is to cross-level or synchronize, align the organization on the mission and the current situation, to unlock subordinate entities from top-down decision-making. if they know what the situation is and know what you're trying to do, they can make decisions without going back up torturous chain of command to do it. Usually that looks like a once in a week or twice a week thing for a period of time. My organization, right now, we do it twice a week. And we get everybody synced, and we use cameras all the time because, again, that increases the cultural connection across people. But when we get in a busy period, like when COVID kicked in, we went to 6 days a week. And anytime you have the waxing and waning of the intensity of the organization, you just dial that up. But you also have to be very intentional about the conduct of it, because it's, when I describe, I had 7,500 people on the one in JSOC, 7,500 people can't all talk. So you have to have a set agenda, but the agenda is not just a set of mechanical reports from people, or each office goes around. It's a conversation, because you can submit the information that's in a report. It's more efficient to send it and tell people to read it. When you interact, it should be the headline that is provided, and then what does this mean? What's the so what here? And then have entities discuss it. And so we found with our clients, when they get, and it takes a little while to get good at it, when you get very effective, people find that session is enough to feel like, okay, I have a general understanding of what the organization's doing, those things that might affect me, what I need to spend more time on, and then those decisions which I can go on and make myself without, expecting that I need to get, a lot more stakeholders involved.
Throughout all of your work, a theme that comes up over and over again is the importance of trust. And this is something that Franklin Covey focuses on. Stephen M. R. Covey wrote Leading at the Speed of Trust. And, it is a kind of seminal concept in Franklin Covey's solutions as well. How do you rebuild trust? I think oftentimes trust is quickly broken. And then talking about the process that you've seen of rebuilding trust over time.
It's funny you respond to that, because when I first took Joint Special Operations Command, we had all these rules. If you wanted to do an operation, you had to have a backup this, you had to have this approval. And it was this torturous maze of things standards you had to meet before you could do anything. And what it meant is you didn't do very much because it was just so hard to get it done. All of those things had been implemented because somebody had violated something or forgotten something or made a mistake. And so a well-intentioned person said, well, if that was a problem here, we're going to fix that problem. And what they do over time is they just burden this thing down till you can't operate. Trust means that you can't put check on everything, because that's almost the opposite of trust. We think about those places where we have to have locks and guards and searchlights and all. That's because we don't trust the environment we're in to provide any kind of security. So what I found, it's first, trust takes time. Stan and Will don't have trust until we've interacted a bit. Now, if somebody who knows you very well comes to me and says, Stan, trust Will, I will extend some trust because I trust that other person. But I won't automatically completely trust you, because we just don't have enough history for me to feel comfortable that you have proven that you can do what you say you do, that you have integrity, and we don't have a relationship. So those three things, I think, are the key pillars of trust. So I think organizations have got to develop processes that provide interactions so that you get to know people and entities so that you trust them. We've got to have things that certify people and things, kind of like the good housekeeping seal of approval, or an inspection report when we go to a restaurant that says this place is hygienic and safe to eat. You've got to have systems that back that up. But then you get speed. As Stephen Covey wrote, the speed of trust, it lowers the bureaucracy. You don't need to check. One quick war story example, we used to do a raid, and it would take about 120 people to raid a target. It would take a group of people who were going to raid the target. It took a group who did what we call supporting fire, stayed back, overwatched with a command element. And we circled the objective with more forces to ensure that no enemy could either escape or reinforce. It took about 120 people. When we got unmanned aerial vehicles, predators, and we could watch, we could do away with all the outside security people, because suddenly we knew if anybody was coming. We could trust what intelligence was saying. If we had good communications, we didn't have to put command group on the ground because we could communicate. We could trust that that would work. We got it down to where you could do a raid with about 20 people, same target, instead of 120, because you trusted those capabilities. Now you could do 6 raids with the same size force that you could do before. That's where you get these economies. Trust is worth almost any investment that an organization makes in it.
Absolutely. No, we totally agree there. So to your comment on any investment that an organization makes in it, in previous conversations, podcasts I've listened to of yours, you talk about how the military does an amazing job investing in leaders, often much more so than corporate America. Why do you think that corporate America seemingly systematically underinvests in leadership?
Yeah, I think there are several reasons. It used to be a greater investment. Look at Crotonville that GE had back in the day, because they thought they were going to keep people for a long time. And in that corporate model, it was more common. Today, in the military, it's still typical to come in as a junior officer or soldier and to matriculate yourself up to being a general or a sergeant major or something. And so the organization is incentivized to continue to invest because that's the talent that's going to be at that level. In the corporate world, where people go laterally so much, the challenge is you're going to spend a bunch of money investing in Will, and then he goes off to somewhere else. And you say, well, wow, that was wasted. I don't think it is wasted. I think much of what Will learned in the organization actually stays in the organization. It's almost by osmosis. And so I also think that the civilian world is a dollars and cents calculation that keeps being recalculated quarterly, not on a long-term basis. And so a leader is often incentivized to cut costs in the near term because it affects returns and stock prices and whatnot, and not held accountable for what happens a decade from now. The military is a little different, and military's got its own weaknesses, believe me, but the reality is so many of the dynamics in the civilian world reward the here and now and punish investment. And so I think we've got to rethink how we approach that.
I think that's right. I think pushing more towards long-term thinking in the corporate world makes sense. In your most recent book on character, the choices that define a life, as I mentioned earlier, it really is a memoir. It's a personal exploration of a lot of the choices you've made. And you have a kind of touching section where you talk about your relationship with your son and how you did and didn't show up as a father, and then your opportunity now as a grandfather. I know a lot of the people listening likely struggle with balancing personal and professional. Where do you invest your time, energy, and resources? So tell me about, maybe if you could share a little bit of that from the book, about your own calculations over time on where you invest personally and professionally, and maybe what you got right, what you got wrong.
Yeah. Let me give you the end point first. My son is a leader in the U.S. intelligence community and doing very well. He lives next door to me with his wife and 3 daughters. So my granddaughters live 20 feet from me. But it was not always that way. I grew up in a family of 6 kids, as did my wife, but we only had 1 son. And so as we raised that son, we moved constantly because I was in the military. He went to 3 different high schools, and we put him through a lot of turmoil in his life. I was always busy, or at least I thought I was. And so I was always working hard and in units that deployed and a lot. I always had a good relationship with my son, but I wasn't the kind of guy who coached his baseball team, who led a Boy Scout troop or did that. I just wasn't good at father that way. I was more passive and supportive. Now, so as a consequence, we didn't develop that really tight relationship that some fathers and sons do. And I left right before he graduated from high school, and I came back after he'd graduated from college. So that was the wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. But at the same time, what I think I got right, I never fought with him over the little things. He went through the period as both, he had shoulder length or longer hair, looked terrible. Then he cut it short, dyed it blonde, looked terrible. Then he went off and got involved in rock music, played punk music for about 7 years, and did it seriously enough where he and his band toured and they had merchandise and they sold CDs. Not good enough to make me rich as a father, but good enough to do that. I never argued with him about any of that. He had this mohawk haircut that would change colors. You know, he would re-dye it. And people would say, you know, you're an Army officer. How do you put up with that? I said, hey, he's not involved with drugs. He doesn't get in any trouble. He's trustworthy. So I'm good with, as long as he's those things, I don't care how he dresses. I don't care what music he plays. And that all worked really well because we never had a falling out or friction. What we had was I would be supportive. He would sort of, I did my thing in life. He's doing his thing. And it's interesting how we've ended up remarkably similar. You know, we share my home gym. I mean, a lot of things about us are, for him, frighteningly similar. But I got that part right. There were battles to fight, and there were battles not worth fighting. And I don't know if I did it consciously, but it has worked quite well for us.
Now, in our final segment, I want to talk about the future of the military, kind of moving on from your leadership lessons to kind of where our military is today and where it's going. I think the number one predictor of whether somebody is in the military is if they have a family member in the military. It really is becoming kind of a hereditary soldier class in America. And I've heard you in the past say you think this is a bad thing for our country. Maybe speak to that briefly. You know, is the military attracting world-class talent still throughout all ranks? And if not, what could we do to improve the military's talent pipeline?
Yeah, I do think that the idea of the military is overpopulated with sons and daughters of veterans. They make good soldiers, but the reality is you don't want that. We don't want the Janissaries. What we want is a military that reflects our entire population. And what I think we haven't done well is we haven't planted the seed in every young person so they are informed enough about what the military might offer so they consider it with all their other options. And then I think I'd like to see our military populated from across our, you know, different parts of our society, different zip codes, different income backgrounds, because it makes it a much more diverse and reflective organization, which it must be to be most effective. And I think that, unfortunately, it is easy for the nation to do an all-volunteer military, just pay money, and the problem kind of goes away because certain people will do it. I think it would be a harder political decision to institute a military draft, but I would. I would have, you know, enlistment for those who want to volunteer, but I'd have a draft for the other people we wanted. And then I would take care of them after service with really good GI Bill and things like that. But I think we've got to understand that when we go to war, we should have all of our society invested and all of our society at risk so that we think we're not going to send our neighbor's kid to war. No, there's every chance that we're sending our kid to war.
Next, I want to ask about kind of global conflicts that we're seeing both have risen and might arise. In a 2021 interview with Tyler Cow in The Economist, you said that people were underestimating the likelihood that China invades Taiwan. How has your perception of that changed over time? And how has what we've seen in Ukraine and Russia and the difficulty of invading another country influenced that perception?
Yeah, I'll go to my thought now. I am not sure China's going to invade Taiwan by any means. I know they would still like to get control of Taiwan and they would like to push America further back. My guess is they think that they can do that without a direct confrontation, that they in fact can become more connected around the world. They can become a global power as we were, and they can then compete to sort of pull Taiwan into their network like Hong Kong was pulled in. But I think having the capability to do it militarily is something they want to have anyway, because it's another thing that encourages us to back off and encourages Taiwan to cut some kind of a deal. So that's worrisome to me, and I don't think we should allow the military balance to get to the point where, an invasion seems like a realistic option to them. I think around the world, I think we need to be thinking about alliances. I think we backed off that in the last few years. I think we should be thinking about strengthening our alliances in every case, both our commercial alliances, our interdependence, and our military connections and our diplomatic, because you're going to need the sinew that comes from that kind of set of relationships. Every company's going to wax and wane in strength, and we will too. And we will be stronger when people know we've got a bunch of people who have come to the conclusion that being allied with us is better than an alternative. I tell people often, when I commanded in Afghanistan, we had a 46-nation coalition. All the other countries didn't come because Afghanistan was important to their foreign policy. They came because the United States asked them to. And they made a calculation that a good relationship with us was worth an investment. And when we lose that, we are going to lose a tremendous capability to influence events around the world, which I think we'll want to have.
So speaking of military capabilities, moving from partnerships with other countries to partnership with the technology sector, there's a new wave of defense tech companies. Palantir and Anduril probably are most well known, but there's a whole crop of these startups being funded today. If you were the Secretary of Defense, would you be partnering more with this emerging kind of Silicon Valley-based defense tech sector, or less, and why?
Yeah, I think partnering more is the way to go. We got a small number of big defense contractors, and if you've ever been involved in it, they develop the expertise in how to sell to the military. It's hard to sell to the military. It takes a structure and learning experience, and so they have this disproportionate advantage, which crowded out small entrepreneurial firms. I think these new firms challenge that, which is very good. Now, what we don't want is we don't want these new firms, Anduril or any of the others, to just become replacements for those old ones that have the same effect. We need to open it up so that all of these smaller startups with some really good ideas have legitimate ways to get in and market their wares, because the next war is going to be won by the people who learn and adapt fastest. It won't be won by the people who enter the war with the right answer. Nobody's going to have the right answer. It's who figures it out, adapts, and implements it.
Wonderful. So I'd like to move, before we close their typical final question, I want to move to a quick lightning round. You mentioned Black Hawk Down earlier. What is your favorite military movie?
Wow, that's a great question. That's funny. I think Black Hawk Down is very realistic, but the problem is most soldiers don't like movies of wars you were ever involved in, because they just can't seem real because you were there and you go, that's not actually what it is. I prefer older military movies, like The Longest Day from World War II, things like that. And I realize that in some cases they are romanticized, or, the hard parts. I think Band of Brothers may be one of the most realistic depictions of the way soldiers are, that miniseries, than anything I've ever watched. From movies to books, I know you're an avid military history reader. If you were recommending a military history book to somebody who has not read any military history, so a 101, what would you encourage? My favorite book it's a novel, actually. It's called Once an Eagle by Anton Myrer, written in 1968, and it's a story of two soldiers whose lives go in parallel through a career that starts during the First World War and ends up after the Korean War. And the reason it's so good is it describes the culture of the military. It covers World War I and World War II, but it's not a treatise on operations. It's leadership, it's organizational culture, it's American culture, it's all of those things. And it's, in my mind, it's a good immersion into how things military actually work.
Wonderful. We are approaching the new year, and many people, I'm sure, are looking for New Year's resolutions. You are famous for your 1 meal a day habit. What is another leadership habit that you would encourage everybody adopt for their New Year's resolution? I don't know if everybody can stick to 1 meal a day. That's a hard one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the first is prioritization. You know, it is prioritize what it is you're trying to do and what you want people to do, and communicate that clearly and stick to it. It's hard to do sometimes because you come up with a list of 20 things and you say, here's what I want you to do. Well, people can't usually do that. That becomes a menu. But if you say, here are the 2 things that matter, and here are 18 other things I'd like you to do, if you have time after doing the first 2, I will underwrite the other 18 not getting done. I think if leaders will show the personal discipline to do that, and they will get in front of people and say, this is what matters, you empower them. You free them up from trying to figure out, okay, of all this stuff on my desk, what should I do first? And so I think it's hard to do, but I think it's invaluable.
Wonderful. So our final closing question, we asked every guest the same. I asked an iteration of it for you earlier, so I'm going to tweak it a bit. So we normally ask people, we are a leadership company. Who is a leader that you've worked with and what have you learned from them over time? You answered a version of that question earlier. So I'm going to tweak it a bit, which is you've been married for almost 50 years now. And which is impressive. Congratulations. I got married a few months ago, so I have a long time to go to match you. So actually, what is a lesson that you have learned from your wife over time?
Yeah. My wife taught me in a bunch of places to understand that what I did mattered, whether I thought it mattered or not. And what I'm talking about is how you treat people, how you interact with people, how you are seen by people. You know, if I'm tired and I'm going through an airport now, she'll go, you know, there's a chance somebody in this airport is going to recognize who you are. And if they see you acting like an idiot, that's going to resonate. Remember that. You have a responsibility to conduct yourself in the way that you are suggesting other people conduct themselves. She's a good reminder for that. The other thing I'd say about marriage is decide you want to be married early. Don't keep questioning that. One of the great things that I think about our marriage is a long time ago, we decided we wanted to be married forever. Now, there have been ups and downs and left and rights, don't get me wrong. But if you make that decision and you say, you know, I'm staying with you, no matter what happens, for better or for worse, richer for poor, sickness and in health, it changes your outlook on things. And I think that's very helpful.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights from all the way from military to marriage and everything in between. It was a great conversation today. I really appreciate the time.
Well, you're kind to have me.
Thank you. And to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. I hope you can take 1 or 2 lessons from today and apply it in your own life, your own journey as a leader. And please share this conversation with somebody who you think could benefit from it as much as you did today. So thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you again next week on Frank and Covey on Leadership.